The day I realized my husband's business partner was stealing from him, I did not hear it in a report. I did not see it in a meeting. I saw it in his smile. That smile looked friendly to everyone else. Calm, loyal, safe. But to me, it looked like a knife already hidden in a sleeve. And the worst part? He was not just stealing money. He was preparing to frame my husband for the crime. My name is Elena, and I still remember the first time I met Daniel's business partner, Marcus. It was a warm evening in Chicago, and Daniel had invited me to dinner after work. He was tired, but in that way successful men often are, his mind never truly resting, always moving from one problem to the next. Daniel had built his software company from nothing. No rich father, no family connections, just long nights, a sharp mind, and a stubborn kind of hope. Marcus had been with him almost from the beginning. That is what Daniel always said. "He's not just my partner," Daniel told me once, smiling with real trust in his eyes. "He's my brother." When a man says that, he means it. At least Daniel did. Marcus was charming in the easy way that makes people relax. He laughed too loudly, shook hands too hard, and always knew how to say the right thing in front of the right people. Investors liked him. Employees respected him. Even I liked him at first. He brought gifts to company events. He remembered birthdays. He spoke about loyalty and teamwork like they were sacred words. I thought Daniel was lucky to have a partner like that. I thought he had found someone who would protect the company the same way he did. I was wrong, and I learned the truth the hard way. It started with something small, a missing invoice. Then a strange delay in a client payment. Then a transfer that Daniel said he had not authorized. At first, he was not worried. Every business has mistakes. Every company has accounting issues from time to time. He told me not to think too much about it. But I noticed something in his face. He was not calm. He was pretending to be calm. Every night, after dinner, he sat at our kitchen table with his laptop open, going through reports over and over again. He rubbed the back of his neck when he was stressed. He drank cold coffee and forgot it was there. He stopped smiling the way he used to. I asked him one evening, "Daniel, what is really going on?" He looked up at me and forced a smile. "Nothing serious," he said. "Just business pressure." But I knew him too well. Married people do not always need words. Sometimes they understand the truth by the silence between sentences. So I started watching more carefully. And that is when I began noticing Marcus. At first, it was little things. He was too eager to answer questions about money. He was too quick to blame the finance team when numbers did not match. He always had an explanation before anyone had even asked the question. He would say things like, "We need to stay united," or "The company is under stress," or "We cannot let emotion interfere with business." Those words sound wise when spoken by the right person. But from Marcus, they started sounding rehearsed. One Friday night, Daniel came home later than usual. He looked exhausted, and when I asked what happened, he said Marcus had insisted on a private meeting with the board advisor. "He says we need to restructure some accounts," Daniel told me. "Did he give a reason?" Daniel shrugged. "He said it would make things cleaner for investors." That should have been normal, but his voice was tight. I asked, "Do you trust him?" Daniel looked at me with the expression of a man who does not want to answer because the answer might hurt. "Of course I trust him," he said. "He's Marcus." That was the first time I felt afraid. Because trust, once spoken that confidently, often hides the deepest danger. A few days later, I was at Daniel's office to drop off lunch. It was around 2 p.m. and the hallway was quiet. Most people were in meetings. I was about to leave when I heard voices coming from Marcus's office. His door was slightly open. I was not trying to listen. But then, I heard Daniel's name. That made me stop. Marcus was speaking in a low voice, almost kind. "I'm telling you, if the numbers are missing, The blame will fall somewhere, he said. We just need to make sure we are prepared. A pause, then another voice. One I did not recognize. What about Daniel? Marcus laughed softly. That depends on what he signs. My stomach went cold. I leaned closer, trying not to breathe too loudly. The unknown voice said, You think he'll take responsibility? Marcus replied, He always has before. I did not wait to hear more. I walked away so fast that my hands were shaking. All the way home, I kept replaying those words in my head. He always has before. That sentence did not sound like respect. Quietly reached out to me. She was nervous when she called. Mrs. Bennet, she said, I don't know if I should be saying this. That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know. Say it, I told her. She lowered her voice. I've been asked to prepare transfer records for Marcus, but some of them don't match the approved budget. I thought maybe it was a clerical issue, but now I'm not sure. My heart began pounding. Does Daniel know? No, she whispered. Marcus said to keep it between us for now. I closed my eyes. Priya, I said, send me everything you have, right now. She hesitated for 1 second, then agreed. When I received the files, I sat in our bedroom with the door locked and studied every page. I am not an accountant, and I am not a lawyer, but I am not stupid either. I could see enough to understand this. Money had been moving in patterns that made no sense. Vendor names changed, payment dates were altered, internal approvals were missing. Some transfers went to shell companies I had never heard of, and all of it connected back to Marcus. Not just stealing, carefully stealing, patiently stealing. And now I understood why. He was building a story where Daniel would look careless, a story where Daniel would look greedy, a story where Daniel would look like the man who had betrayed everyone. I felt sick, not because the money was gone, because Marcus had not only taken from the company, he had taken the trust Daniel placed in him and used it like a weapon. I spent the next 2 days collecting everything I could. I saved emails. I checked timestamps. I cross-referenced bank records with meeting notes. I even pulled old calendar invites and compared them with the days the money moved. And slowly, a pattern appeared. Whenever Daniel was out of the office, Marcus was moving funds. Whenever Daniel was busy with clients, Marcus was changing records. Whenever Daniel trusted him most, Marcus was doing the worst damage. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a plan. And the final part of the plan was the one that made my hands shake. Marcus had arranged for a fake authorization trail that made it appear Daniel had approved the transfers himself. He was going to frame Daniel. At first, I could not even process the cruelty of it. Daniel had helped him when Marcus was broke. Daniel had defended him in investor meetings. Daniel had protected him when people questioned his decisions. And this was how Marcus repaid him. I sat there in silence for a long time, staring at my screen, feeling something hard and cold rise inside me. Not rage, something stronger, clarity. When Daniel came home that night, I did not scream at him. I did not wave papers in his face. I simply placed everything on the kitchen table and said, "Read." He looked tired, confused, maybe even annoyed at first. But as he read, his expression changed. The color slowly drained from his face. He read once, then again, then a third time. Slower. Finally, he looked up at me. "No," he said quietly. I nodded. "Yes." He swallowed hard. "Are you sure?" I reached across the table and touched his hand. "I am sure." The room went still. Then he leaned back in his chair and covered his face with both hands. I had never seen him look so broken. Not because the company was in danger, because the man he had trusted like family had been lying to him for who knows how long. "I should have seen it," he said. "No," I replied. You trusted him. That is not a crime. He laughed once bitterly. In business, it might be. There was no sleep in our house that night. We worked until past 3 a.m., making copies, backing up files, organizing proof. I printed emails and account trails. Daniel called the company's legal counsel. Priya agreed to meet us early the next morning. One of the auditors Daniel trusted most finally confirmed what we feared. Money had been diverted over months, maybe longer. And Marcus had already started setting Daniel up. He had filed internal complaints suggesting Daniel was hiding expenses. He had quietly told a board member that Daniel was emotionally unstable under pressure. That was the final insult. He was not just stealing. He was preparing the stage for Daniel to be removed before the truth could catch him. But Marcus made one mistake. He underestimated me. He thought I was just the wife, the woman who brought lunch, the woman who asked too many questions, the woman who should stay out of business matters. He forgot that women notice everything, especially when someone they love is being hunted. The next morning, Daniel and I went to the office early. We did not tell Marcus what we had found. We did not warn him. We waited. By 9:30, the board meeting was already scheduled. Marcus arrived wearing his usual perfect smile. He greeted everyone with easy confidence, as if nothing in the world could touch him. He saw Daniel and actually smiled wider. "Morning, buddy," he said. Buddy. That word now made my skin crawl. Daniel did not smile back. Marcus noticed, but only for a second. Then he glanced at me and gave the polite nod people give when they do not believe a woman belongs in the room. That was his second mistake. Because by then, the room already belonged to the truth. When the meeting began, Marcus acted calm. He spoke about financial corrections, temporary losses, and the need for accountability. He used polished language, the kind that sounds responsible when spoken quickly enough. Then he turned toward Daniel. "Unfortunately," Marcus said, "there are signs that some unauthorized transfers may be linked to decisions made under Daniel's direction." The room went quiet. Daniel did not move. Marcus continued, "I think the board deserves transparency. We need to determine who approved these transactions and why." He was setting the trap in public. He really thought he had won. That was when Daniel slowly stood up, and in a voice much steadier than I expected, he said, "Then let us look at the records." Marcus frowned slightly. "We already have." Daniel shook his head. "Not the real records." A murmur moved through the room. Marcus's expression changed for the first time. A tiny crack appeared. He looked at the board members, then at the legal counsel, then at me. I placed a thick folder on the table. Inside were the emails, the transfers, the altered approvals, the vendor records, the private messages, the calendar evidence, the backup copies. Every step Marcus had taken was documented. He stared at the folder, and for 1 second he forgot how to smile. The board chair asked him, "Mr. Cole, do you want to explain this?" Marcus swallowed. "This is not what it looks like." Daniel turned to him. "You always said that," Daniel said quietly. "Whenever there was a problem, you had an explanation. But explanations don't matter now. The facts do." Marcus tried to recover. He laughed once, too quickly. "You think this proves anything? People make mistakes. Accounts get mixed up. Maybe someone else had access." Priya then walked into the room. She had come prepared to speak, and she was not afraid anymore. Her voice shook only slightly as she said, "Marcus instructed me to change the routing on several payments. He told me not to tell Daniel. He said the board would handle it later." Marcus froze. That was the moment I saw it. Real fear. Not the kind people fake. The kind that comes when the floor finally disappears under them. He tried one last time. He pointed at Daniel and said, "He's twisting everything because he's losing control." But no one believed him anymore. Because truth, once exposed, has a weight lying can never carry. Security was called. The legal team stepped in. Marcus kept talking, but his words fell apart. He became louder, then defensive, then desperate. He started blaming assistants, outside consultants, pressure from investors, market instability, anything he could throw into the air to save himself. But it was too late. The evidence was too clean. The pattern was too clear. And the worst part for him was that Daniel did not yell. Daniel did not beg. Daniel only looked at him with a kind of exhausted sadness that was somehow more powerful than anger. "I trusted you," he said. Marcus stared at him, but for the first time he had nothing to say. That sentence landed harder than any accusation, because sometimes the deepest punishment is not prison. It is being seen clearly by the person you tried to destroy. The board suspended Marcus immediately. An outside investigation began that same week. The money trail led exactly where we expected. Shell companies, dummy accounts, false invoices, hidden transfers. He had been bleeding the business slowly while preparing to blame Daniel for the collapse. And the shocking part? He had almost gotten away with it. If I had not listened outside that office, if Priya had stayed silent, if Daniel had signed one more false document, the entire company could have fallen on his head. But truth did what it always does. It kept moving, slowly, quietly, until it could no longer be ignored. The months after that were not easy. Daniel had to rebuild trust with investors, clients, and employees. He had to face public rumors and private disappointment. Some people apologized. Some people disappeared. A few even acted as if they had known all along. That is how cowardice works. It waits until the danger is over, then pretends it was wisdom. But Daniel did not break. Not fully. There were nights when he was silent for hours. There were mornings when he looked like he had aged 10 years. There were moments when he still asked me, almost like a child, how did I not see it? And every time, I told him the same thing. Because you trusted him. That trust was not weakness. It was the reason Marcus's betrayal hurt so deeply. But it was also the reason Daniel remained decent. When everything around him turned ugly, he never became cruel. He never started seeing every person as a threat. He stayed himself. And in a world full of people trying to survive by becoming harder, that felt like its own kind of victory. As for Marcus, the legal process moved forward. The details were ugly and exhausting, and the company had to face every hidden layer he had buried. But the evidence held. The lies collapsed. The story he built around Daniel fell apart piece by piece. And when it was all over, Daniel said something I have never forgotten. He told me, "I thought losing money would be the worst part." I asked, "What was the worst part?" He looked toward the window for a long time before answering, realizing the betrayal had a face I trusted. That sentence stayed with me, because that is what betrayal really is. Not just theft, not just lies. It is the shock of discovering that danger was smiling at you the whole time. Today, the company is still standing. Smaller, yes. Changed, definitely. But stronger in the way steel is stronger after fire. Daniel no longer calls Marcus a brother. He does not even call him a partner. He calls him what he was. A warning. And me? I learned something I will never forget. Sometimes the person who saves the truth is not the one with the title, or the power, or the numbers. Sometimes it is the one quietly paying attention. The one who hears the wrong tone in a voice. The one who notices a lie before everyone else is ready to admit it. The one who keeps looking when others tell her to relax. That is what saved Daniel. Not luck, not chance. Attention, and love. Because love is not only soft. Sometimes love is the thing that stays awake at night. Sometimes love is the thing that checks the emails. The investigation did not end in a single day. It never does. People imagine betrayal is exposed in one dramatic moment, one explosive sentence, one perfect confession. But real betrayal leaves behind a mess. Question, lawyers, emails, denied meetings, sudden silence from people who used to say hello. For weeks after the board meeting, Daniel lived in that strange space between shock and survival. He still went to work every morning, still answered calls, still signed documents, but something in him had changed. It was subtle at first. He was quieter, more careful. He looked at people longer before he spoke, as if he was no longer sure who was real and who was performing. I hated seeing that in him, not because he had become weak, because he had become cautious in a world where he had once been open. One evening, about 3 weeks after Marcus was suspended, Daniel came home earlier than usual. It was raining outside, and his suit jacket was damp at the shoulders. He stood in the doorway for a moment without moving, like he had forgotten how to enter his own house. I set down the towel I had been folding and asked, "What happened?" He looked at me, and his face had that tired, hollow look I had started seeing more often. "They found more accounts," he said. My stomach tightened. "More?" He nodded slowly. Marcus did not just take money from the company. He used company money to pay personal debts, private loans, even a luxury apartment he was hiding through another name. I stared at him. "An apartment?" "Yes." He let out a bitter breath. He was living like a man who thought he would never be caught. I sat down across from him. "What about the framing?" I asked. Daniel lowered his eyes. He was preparing a report. If the board had not asked for that meeting, if we had not brought the files, they might have believed him. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The rain tapped softly against the windows. The house was quiet except for that sound and the faint hum of the refrigerator. It felt wrong that the world could still be so peaceful when so much damage had been done. Finally, Daniel said, "I keep thinking about how long he must have been planning this." I said nothing, because there was no simple answer. "How long did he smile at me?" Daniel whispered. "While building all of this behind my back." That was the question that hurt him most. Not the money, not the company, the smile, the daily normal kindness that now felt poisoned. I moved closer and took his hand. "People like that don't wake up one day and become dangerous," I said softly. "They hide it for a long time." Daniel gave a small nod, but he was not really listening. He was staring at the table, lost in memory. Then he said something that stayed with me. "I almost fired one of our junior analysts last year because Marcus told me she was slow. He said she was causing delays. But later I found out she had been the one who noticed irregularities in the accounting system." I looked at him. He continued. "Marcus made me think she was the problem. Maybe he did that more than once." That was the moment I realized how deep his manipulation had gone. It was not only theft, it was influence. He had been shaping Daniel's decisions, softly, over time, making him trust the wrong people, making him doubt the right ones, slowly turning the workplace into a place where Marcus's word carried more weight than the truth. That kind of control is terrifying because it does not look like force. It looks like friendship. The next day, Daniel asked me to come with him to the office again. This time, the atmosphere was different. The front desk staff smiled nervously. People lowered their voices when we walked by. The company had entered the phase where everyone knew something terrible had happened, but no one wanted to say the wrong thing. In the conference room, the outside investigator laid out more evidence. This time, the pattern was even worse than we expected. Marcus had not acted alone in every step, but he had clearly orchestrated the scheme. He created false backup records, approved phony reimbursements through secondary accounts, and used pressure tactics to keep others quiet. He had even hinted to 2 employees that Daniel was losing his grip and needed to be watched. One of those employees had written a private note about it. That note small as it was, became another piece of the case. The investigator looked at Daniel and said, "He appears to have been preparing this for months, possibly longer." Daniel leaned back in his chair, expressionless for a few seconds. Then he asked, "Why?" It was the simplest question in the world, and the one no one could answer cleanly. The investigator hesitated. Money is usually the surface reason. Ego, resentment, fear of losing control. Those things often sit underneath. Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile. So, he wanted more than money. Yes, the investigator said. He wanted power. That word hung in the room. Power. It explained everything and nothing. At first, I thought Daniel would finally explode after hearing it. I thought he might slam his hand on the table or curse Marcus's name. But he did none of that. He only sat there, calm in a way that worried me. That evening when we got home, I found him standing in the dark living room, looking out the window. "You okay?" I asked gently. He did not turn around. "I used to think loyalty was something you earned by being decent," he said. "Now I wonder if some people only stay close because they are waiting for the right moment to betray you." I went to stand beside him. "No," I said. "Not some people, just the wrong ones." He finally turned to me. His eyes were tired, but there was still something alive in them. "Do you know what hurts the most?" he asked. I shook my head. "I keep replaying all the small moments," he said. "The lunches, the jokes, the meetings, the late nights. I thought we were building something together." His voice dropped. "We were, just not the same thing." That sentence made my chest ache, because that was the cruelest part of betrayal. One person thinks they are building a future, the other's building an exit. The next week brought the first public fallout. An internal memo went out to key investors and senior employees, carefully worded but impossible to misread. Temporary restrictions had been placed on. Daniel was fully cooperating with the investigation. The rumor machine, of course, moved faster than facts. By noon, people outside the company were already guessing. By evening, a few industry blogs had posted partial stories. Some were accurate. Some were lazy. Some were cruel. I watched Daniel read one headline and close his phone with a look of quiet disgust. "They want a villain," he said. "They do not care if they get the truth." I knew he was right. That was another wound Marcus had left behind. Not just the theft, but the story people would now tell about it. Even innocent men can become suspicious once enough smoke is in the air. That weekend, we met with the company's attorney and decided Daniel needed to address the staff directly, not with a polished corporate statement, with his own voice. The morning of the meeting, he stood in front of the mirror for several minutes, adjusting his tie and then untying it again. I could tell he was fighting to keep his hands steady. "You do not have to be perfect," I told him. He looked at me through the mirror and gave a small, tired smile. "That's the problem," he said. "I used to think I had to be." I stepped closer. "Tell them the truth. That is enough." When he walked into the auditorium, the room was full. Employees sat in rows with serious faces. Some looked scared. Some looked angry. Some looked ashamed, as if they had failed some test no one told them they were taking. Daniel stood at the podium for a long moment before speaking. I watched from the side. At first his voice was tight. Then it steadied. He told them what had happened. Not every detail. Not the legal strategy. Just the truth. That Marcus had abused his position. That funds had been misused. That an attempt had been made to shift blame. That the company would cooperate fully with the investigation and protect anyone who came forward with information. He paused once, then added something I had not expected. "I know some of you are afraid," he said. "I know some of you are angry. And I know some of you may feel disappointed in me because this happened under my leadership. The room was silent. He continued, all I can say is this. I trusted the wrong person, but I will not punish the whole company for one man's betrayal. I felt my eyes sting. That was Daniel. Even after everything, he was still trying to protect the people around him. Not because he was weak, because he was decent. When the meeting ended, several employees came forward not to defend Marcus, but to say they were relieved the truth was finally out. A few even admitted they had noticed strange behavior before, but had been too nervous to speak. That part hurt Daniel too, not because he blamed them, because it proved how fear had spread quietly while Marcus stayed charming in public. One employee, a middle-aged engineer named Stefan, stayed behind after everyone left. He looked embarrassed, as if he had carried something heavy for too long. Mr. Bennett, he said, I should have said something months ago. Daniel looked at him kindly. What did you see? Stefan swallowed. Marcus kept asking questions about your approval patterns. Not normal questions. He wanted to know when you signed, how often, and whether anyone else could match your digital access. At the time, I thought maybe he was just trying to improve workflow. Daniel's jaw tightened. Did you tell anyone? Stefan shook his head. No, and I'm sorry. Daniel was quiet for a second, then said, Thank you for telling me now. After he left, Daniel sat in the empty auditorium like a man who had suddenly become aware of how fragile everything is. I went to sit beside him. More people knew than we thought, he said. Yes, I replied, but not everyone who knew understood. He nodded slowly, and Marcus knew exactly how to use that. That was true. He had built his whole scheme around the fact that most people do not want to believe a trusted man is evil. It is easier to assume a mistake than to face betrayal. It is easier to say, maybe there is another explanation, than to say, someone I respected was lying to me. That is why men like Marcus survive as long as they do. They count on hesitation. They count on politeness. They count on silence. But this time, silence had failed him. The investigation kept moving. Bank records were matched. Communications were recovered. Patterns were mapped. And each new detail made the same story clearer. Marcus had been carefully feeding false information to the board, positioning Daniel as overwhelmed and potentially unreliable. He had used Daniel's trust, his schedule, his habits, even his reputation, to make the setup believable. The most disturbing part was that he had almost succeeded. That word almost haunted Daniel more than the betrayal itself. Almost destroyed, almost framed, almost ruined. It is a cruel thing to survive something that was so close to ending you. One night, maybe a month after everything started, Daniel came into the kitchen while I was making tea. He sat at the table and said, Do you know what I keep thinking about? I looked at him. What? If you had not heard that conversation outside Marcus's office, he did not finish. He did not need to. I put the teapot down and sat across from him. But I did hear it, I said. He nodded. And if Priya had not sent the records? She did, I said. And if the board had not demanded a full audit? They did. He looked at me for a long second. Then, very quietly, he said, It feels like the truth kept finding us. I smiled a little. That is because truth does not stay buried forever. He looked down at the table, thoughtful. I used to think the most dangerous person in business was the one who looked mean, he said. Now I think it is the one who looks helpful. I did not disagree. A few weeks later, the final suspension notice was issued. Marcus was officially removed pending criminal proceedings. His public image collapsed with shocking speed. The same people who had praised him now avoided his name. The same investors who had once enjoyed his confidence now called him a liability. That part was ugly too. Not because he did not deserve consequences. He did. But because it showed how shallow admiration can be when it is built on appearances alone. People had loved his polished image. They had trusted his easy smile. They had mistaken performance for character. And now they were embarrassed to admit how fully they had been fooled. Daniel did not celebrate. That surprised some people. They expected anger to turn into triumph. But the truth is, once betrayal reaches a certain depth, victory never feels clean. It feels like damage control. It feels like surviving a fire and counting what remains. One evening, long after the case had settled into the slow grind of legal process, Daniel and I sat on our balcony with coffee. The city was glowing below us. Cars moved through the streets. Windows lit up one by one as people returned home to their ordinary lives. Daniel stared at the skyline and said, "I thought success would protect me." I replied, "Success only gives people more to steal." He gave a small laugh, but it faded quickly. Then he said, "I still do not understand how he could look me in the face every day." I answered carefully, "Because some people do not feel shame the way honest people do." He was quiet. After a while, he asked, "Do you think I was stupid?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I turned to him immediately. "No," I said. "Never." He looked unconvinced. I leaned closer. "You were loyal. There is a difference. You were building with someone you believed in. That is not stupidity. That is humanity." His eyes softened a little. I continued, "The problem was not that you trusted, the problem was that he lied." That evening, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I think I need to start trusting people differently." I smiled gently. "That is fair." He nodded, as if settling something inside himself. "And I think," he added, "I need to trust myself more." That was the real turning point. Not the arrest, not the headlines, not the documents. The moment he started believing his own instincts again. Because betrayal does not only break relationships, it breaks inner confidence. It makes you question the red flags you saw, the things you ignored, the times you stayed quiet, the moments you gave someone the benefit of the doubt. Recovery begins when a person stops asking, "How did I miss it?" and starts asking, "What do I know now?" Daniel got there slowly, very slowly, but he got there. And in the end, that was enough. Months later, when the company was finally stable again, Daniel asked me to join him at a small dinner with a few of the employees who had helped uncover the fraud. Priya was there. So was Stefan. A few others came too. The atmosphere was different now. Less polished. More real. There was laughter, but it was careful. There was relief, but it had depth. No one was pretending nothing had happened. That was the beauty of it. The company had stopped acting like a perfect machine and started feeling like a group of human beings who had gone through something ugly and come out more honest. At one point during dinner, Priya lifted her glass and said, "To the people who pay attention." Everyone laughed softly. Daniel looked at me across the table. His expression said everything words could not. He knew exactly who had paid attention first, and I knew exactly why that mattered. Because sometimes the first clue is not in a spreadsheet. Sometimes it is in a voice, a pause, a look, a smile that lasts too long. And sometimes the person who saves everything is the one who refuses to ignore that small, uneasy feeling in her chest. Later that night, when we got home, Daniel stood in the doorway and took a deep breath. "Do you think I will ever fully forget this?" he asked. I shook my head. "No," I said, "but you will carry it differently." He thought about that. Then he nodded. And that, in the end, was the truth of it. He would never forget Marcus. He would never forget the theft. He would never forget the day trust turned into a trap. But he would also not let it define the rest of his life. That is how strong people survive betrayal. Not by erasing it, by refusing to become it. And me? I will never forget the look on Marcus's face when the folder opened in that boardroom. It was not just fear. It was the look of a man watching the story he built collapse in real time. He had counted on silence. He had counted on loyalty. He had counted on Daniel being too decent to suspect him. But decency, when backed by truth, can be far more dangerous than cruelty. Because cruelty hides in the open, truth waits, then strikes with precision. And if you are wondering whether Daniel recovered, I will tell you this. He did not return to the person he was before. He became something better. Not softer, not colder, stronger, visa, less eager to believe every polished promise. The first real silence after all the chaos felt strange, not peaceful, just strange. For so long, every day had been filled with calls, meetings, reports, legal reviews, and the constant pressure of waiting for the next bad thing to appear. When things finally settled down, Daniel and I did not know what to do with the quiet. He would sit at the dining table after dinner and stare at nothing for long stretches of time. Not because he was lost, because he was thinking about every small sign he missed, thinking about every person who had smiled at him while hiding the truth, thinking about how quickly a life built over years can shake when one wrong person is standing too close. One Sunday morning, I found him in his office before sunrise. The room was still dark except for the thin gray light coming through the blinds. He was sitting in his chair with a folder open in front of him, but I could tell he was not reading it. I knocked softly on the doorframe. He looked up. "You are awake early. So are you." He gave a tired smile. I stepped in and looked at the folder. It was full of printed emails, audit notes, and investigation summaries. He had kept everything. "Still going through it?" I asked. He rubbed his face. "I thought I was done. But every time I look at the company now, I remember what happened." I sat across from him. "That does not mean the company is ruined." "No," he said quietly. "It means I am changed." That answer stayed with me, because he was right. Betrayal does not leave people untouched. It reaches inside and rearranges them. It changes how they speak, how they listen, how they trust, how they sleep. It teaches lessons nobody asks for. For Daniel, one of the hardest lessons was accepting that being careful did not make him weak. He had always believed strength meant staying open, staying generous, staying confident. Now he was learning that strength sometimes means being slower to believe, slower to grant access, slower to hand someone the keys to everything, not because the world is evil, because not everyone in it is honest. The criminal case moved forward more slowly than either of us expected. Months passed. Witnesses were interviewed. Bank trails were verified. Internal messages were recovered. A forensic team rebuilt the timeline piece by piece. And every time they added a new layer, Marcus's story fell apart more. It turned out he had used multiple layers of deception, fake vendors, misleading expense entries, indirect transfers, personal payments masked as consulting costs. He had even created documents that made it look like Daniel had been aware of the spending months earlier. But once the investigators matched metadata, file versions, and access logs, the illusion collapsed. One day, Daniel received a call from the attorney. I was with him when it came through. He answered, listened for a moment, and then said, "Yes, I understand." His face did not change much, but I could tell from the way his hand tightened around the phone that something important was happening. When he hung up, I asked, "What is it?" He sat very still. "They found the final digital record." I waited. "It proves Marcus created a hidden approval chain from a separate account." My chest tightened. "So he really did it?" Daniel nodded. It proves the frame job, too. That should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the end of something painful that had lasted too long. The truth was finally no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. And facts do not comfort you when they arrive after your life has already been damaged. That evening, Daniel canceled all his calls and asked me to go with him for a drive. We did not have a destination. We just drove through the city streets, past office towers, past restaurants full of people laughing over dinner, past glowing storefronts and traffic lights, and the ordinary motion of a world that kept going no matter what had happened to us. After a while, he said, "I used to think I could read people." I looked at him. "I thought I had a good instinct for character," he continued. "I thought I would see this kind of thing coming." I was quiet for a moment, then said, "Most people who get betrayed feel that way." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "That is not very comforting." "No," I said, "but it is true." He drove in silence for a while after that. Then he asked, "Do you know what hurts even more than the theft?" I shook my head, though he could not see me clearly in the dim light. "I keep thinking about how often I defended him," he said. "How many times I told others to give him the benefit of the doubt. How many times I believed the lie before the truth." I turned toward him. "That is what decent people do," I said. He looked at me with tired eyes. "Decent people can still be fooled." "Yes," I replied. "That does not make them foolish." He went quiet again. Then, very softly, he said, "I needed to hear that from you." That was one of the moments I will always remember, because it showed me how deeply betrayal had wounded his confidence. He did not just need proof. He needed permission to stop blaming himself for trusting a man who did not deserve it. Not long after that, the case moved into its final phase. Marcus agreed to a formal interview under legal pressure. By then, his arrogance had vanished. The reports said he was defensive at first, then agitated, then strangely quiet when confronted with the full paper trail. I did not attend the interview, but Daniel did. When he came home afterward, he looked drained. He sat at the kitchen island for a long time before speaking. "What did he say?" I asked. Daniel stared at the counter. At first, he denied everything. I stayed silent. Then he blamed the finance department. I nodded slowly. Then he said the transfers were temporary and would have been reversed. And then, Daniel looked at me. Then he said he never meant for it to go this far. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. That sounds like a lie built on top of a lie. It was. He rubbed his eyes. But the strangest part is that he still did not fully sound sorry. I frowned. "Not fully?" "He sounded sorry that he got caught," Daniel said. "Not sorry that he did it." That distinction made my skin cold, because that was the kind of man Marcus really was. The kind who could call himself unfortunate while destroying another person's life. The kind who treated betrayal like a business mistake. The kind who believed remorse was something you performed when the evidence became too heavy to resist. After that, the company started rebuilding for real. Not the fake kind of rebuilding people talk about in press releases. The real kind. The kind that costs time. The kind that hurts. The kind that requires making choices that no one claps for. New controls were added. Access was limited. Independent audits became routine. Employees were retrained. Old systems were replaced. And slowly, the atmosphere changed. People started speaking more honestly. Meetings became less polished, but more useful. People asked questions they were once afraid to ask. The company was no longer pretending to be invincible. And strangely, that made it stronger. Daniel changed too. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way people expect after a scandal. He did not become cold. He did not become paranoid. He did not turn into the kind of man who punishes everyone because one person betrayed him. Instead, he became more measured, more present, more aware of how power can be misused when nobody is watching. He also became more human in public. He stopped pretending he had every answer. He admitted when something was still uncertain. He listened more carefully to junior staff. And perhaps most importantly, he learned to ask for help without shame. That alone was worth everything he had survived. One afternoon, about 6 months later, he came home carrying a small paper bag from a bakery. He put it on the counter and said, "I ran into Priya." I smiled. "How is she?" "Good," he said. "She is getting promoted." That made me smile wider. "She deserves it." He nodded. Then he stood there for a moment, and I could tell he had something else on his mind. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "She told me something that made me think." "About what?" He leaned against the counter. "She said the reason she finally spoke up was because she noticed I looked genuinely worried. Not angry, not suspicious, just worried." I listened carefully. She said, Daniel continued, "It made her think I might actually listen if she told the truth." I smiled gently. "That sounds like you." He shook his head. "No, it sounds like the version of me I almost lost." That was a painful thing to hear, but not a false one. People often survive betrayal by losing parts of themselves. The challenge is not only to recover, it is to recover without becoming less kind than before. A few weeks later, Daniel asked me to come with him to a charity dinner, hosted by one of the company's longtime partners. It was the first public event we had attended since everything happened. I remember standing beside him in the ballroom, listening to the soft noise of glasses and polite conversation, and realizing how much had changed in such a short time. People approached him carefully now, some with sympathy, some with curiosity, some with the awkward energy people use when they are trying not to mention the obvious. But Daniel handled it with quiet grace. He thanked people. He kept the conversation moving. He did not overshare. He did not hide. That balance was new for him, healthy, but hard-earned. Even after the truth came out, there was one thing nobody warned me about. When betrayal ends, it does not feel like relief right away. It feels like exhaustion, the kind that goes deeper than tired bones or sleepless nights. The kind that settles into your chest and makes even simple things feel heavy. Daniel and I both lived inside that exhaustion for a while. Not in silence exactly, more like in fragments. He would wake up early, make coffee, sit by the window, and just stare out at the street as if the world outside had continued without permission. I would watch him from the doorway and wonder how a man who had survived so much could still look so quietly wounded. Some days he seemed fine. On other days, a sound, a name, or even a certain tone in a conversation would pull him right back into the memory of Marcus. That is how betrayal works. It does not leave when the case is over. It stays in the body, in the habits, in the pauses, in the way a person glances at an email twice before replying, in the way trust becomes a little more expensive. One evening, about 2 months after Marcus was removed from the company, Daniel came home holding a small envelope. He looked at it for a moment before handing it to me. "What is this?" I asked. "A letter," he said. "From Marcus." I felt my stomach turn. I opened it carefully, as if the paper itself might be contaminated. It was short, too short for the damage he had done. He did not deny everything this time. He did not threaten. He did not blame anybody else. He said he had made bad decisions under pressure. He said he had lost sight of boundaries. He said he regretted the harm caused. Those words should have sounded like repentance. They did not. They sounded like a man trying to shrink a disaster into something easier to survive. I read the letter once. Then I handed it back to Daniel. He did not even glance at it again. "What do you think?" he asked. I exhaled slowly. I think he is trying to protect the version of himself he still wants to believe in. Daniel nodded, almost to himself. That is what I thought too. He folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not because it mattered, because closure is sometimes just a place to put the evidence. Later that week, the attorney confirmed what we had suspected all along. Marcus was cooperating only after being cornered. He was trying to reduce consequences, not accept responsibility. There were still hearings ahead. There were still financial losses to recover. Still reputational damage to repair. Still employees who had to be reassured. Still investors who needed proof that the company could be trusted again. And that part of the story was harder than the betrayal itself in some ways. Because betrayal is one wound. Rebuilding is 1,000 tiny cuts. It meant reviewing every process. It meant admitting the company had been too dependent on one person's authority. It meant putting safeguards in place that should have existed from the beginning. It meant Daniel had to stand in front of people again and explain not just what had happened, but what he was going to do differently now. The first time he gave that speech, his voice was steady, but I knew him well enough to hear the strain underneath. He did not try to sound perfect anymore. That was part of the change. Before, he used to think leadership meant confidence without cracks. Now he understood something better. Leadership means being honest enough to say where the cracks are so they do not become collapse points later. The employees responded differently than I expected. Some were angry at first. Not at Daniel, but at the whole situation. They had lost confidence too. They had worried about their jobs, their plans, their own stability. A few people privately admitted they had almost left. One younger engineer told Daniel, "I did not know if this place was safe anymore." Daniel listened to him carefully and said, "It wasn't. Not completely. That's the truth. And I intend to make it safer." That answer mattered more than any polished apology could have. Because people do not only want explanations, they want honesty that costs something. They want to know the person in charge is not hiding behind corporate language. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel gave them that. A few weeks later, he asked me to review a new internal ethics policy the legal team had drafted. I laughed a little when he handed it to me. "You trust my opinion on this now?" I asked. He looked up from his desk and gave me a tired smile. "After everything?" "More than most." I sat down and skimmed the document. It was full of protections, controls, reporting channels, and audit requirements. "Strong," I said. "Maybe even a little too cautious." He nodded. "Good. You sound relieved." "I am," he said. "I never want to be blind like that again." There was no anger in his voice anymore when he said it, just a kind of clear sadness. That is what healing began to look like for him. Not forgetting, not pretending, just seeing more clearly. And while the company was working to rebuild its structure, Daniel was quietly rebuilding something else too. His confidence, his instinct, his willingness to trust himself when something felt off. That became important one afternoon when an investor called and suggested bringing in a new executive advisor. The man had an excellent resume, excellent references, excellent reputation. The kind of profile people usually trust immediately. Daniel read the file, then handed it to me across the desk. "What do you think?" he asked. I studied it. The background looked spotless, maybe too spotless. I tapped one section. There's no real evidence of what he did in his last company, just titles and praise. Daniel nodded slowly. Exactly. He did not reject the man out of fear. He investigated further. He asked questions. He checked references more carefully than before. And eventually they discovered that the candidate had a history of shifting blame during internal disputes. Not a theft case, not the same kind of betrayal, but enough to show Daniel that the lesson had stuck. He was no longer ignoring his gut in the name of convenience. That, more than anything, was the real aftermath of Marcus's betrayal. Not the headlines, not the legal case, not the money. The fact that Daniel had learned how to listen to the quiet warning inside himself. As for Marcus, the public eventually stopped talking about him. But in the legal system, the story kept moving. Depositions, document reviews, financial tracing, negotiations. The process was slow and frustrating. And every time Daniel had to sign another statement or review another exhibit, he looked older for a moment afterward. Not weaker, just older. The kind of older that comes from seeing something ugly all the way through. One night, after a long meeting with the attorneys, he came home and sat down without taking off his coat. I brought him tea and placed it in front of him. He stared at it for a second, then smiled faintly. I think this is the first calm thing I've had all day. I sat beside him. How bad was it? He leaned back and closed his eyes. Bad enough that I hate hearing his name now. I did not answer. Not because he won, he said. Because I still cannot believe he planned this while looking me in the eye. I touched his hand. I know. He opened his eyes and looked at me. Do you know what the worst part is? I waited. I almost missed the person I thought he was. That was the part nobody says out loud, but almost everyone feels. You do not only grieve the damage, you grieve the illusion, the friend you thought existed, the partnership you thought was real, the version of the story that made your world make sense. And losing that can hurt as much as losing the person himself. I squeezed his hand gently. You can miss the illusion, I said. Just do not confuse it with the truth. He nodded. Then, he said something that surprised me. I think that's why I haven't wanted to meet too many people lately. I looked at him. He gave a small shrug. Everyone feels like a risk. I considered that. Then I said, that's normal, but not forever. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then, very softly, he replied, I hope not. The months that followed became a slow, careful reset. He started taking walking meetings instead of always sitting in conference rooms. He began showing up earlier, leaving earlier, trying to reclaim some balance. He made time for the employees who were most affected by the scandal. He did not try to win them back with speeches. He just listened, and that listening mattered. One junior analyst told him, it helps that you ask questions now instead of assuming everything is fine. Daniel smiled at her and said, I learned that the hard way. She smiled back, relieved to hear honesty instead of a polished line. That was the new Daniel. Not perfect, not naive, but grounded, and more aware of how trust should actually work. Trust was no longer a floodlight. It was a door he opened carefully, one lock at a time. That change saved him. It also made him stronger as a leader. The company's culture slowly began to shift from polished performance to real accountability. People stopped pretending mistakes were invisible. They started reporting concerns earlier. Managers began asking better questions. Meetings became less impressive and more useful. And over time, the very damage Marcus had caused became the reason the company got better. That is one of the cruelly beautiful things about surviving a betrayal like this. It forces honesty. Where comfort once ruled, it exposes what was fragile. It makes hidden problems impossible to ignore. I still remember the first staff meeting when nobody was trying to sound perfect. A developer stood up and said, I was afraid to speak up before. Another person admitted, I saw strange transaction patterns and assumed someone else would handle it. And instead of shame crushing the room, there was something else. Recognition. Not because people were proud of the failure, because they were finally learning to tell the truth before disaster arrived. Daniel looked around the room afterward and said, "This is what I wanted from the beginning. Not a company that looks clean, a company that is clean." That line stayed with me because it was not about image. It was about integrity. And integrity, once you have lost it once, becomes the only thing worth rebuilding carefully. The legal case eventually reached its final outcome. I will not pretend every detail was satisfying. It rarely is. Real justice is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is paperwork. Sometimes it is hearings. Sometimes it is a financial settlement. Sometimes it is knowing the truth has been formally recorded, even if it did not restore everything you lost. Marcus faced consequences, serious ones. But the bigger victory was not his punishment. It was that he no longer controlled the story. That belonged to Daniel now, and to the truth. The last time Daniel mentioned Marcus to me, it was late at night after a long day. We were in bed, the room dark, the city lights faint through the curtains. He turned to me and said, "I used to think betrayal needed hatred to survive." I looked at him, waiting. "But he didn't hate me," he said. "At least not openly. He just saw me as useful, then disposable." That sentence was colder than anger, because it was probably true. And yet, after a while, Daniel said something I will always remember. "I think that makes it easier to let go." I smiled a little in the dark. "How so?" He stared at the ceiling for a moment before answering. "Because hatred means the other person still matters too much." I did not respond right away. Then I whispered, "You are learning." He gave a quiet, tired laugh. Slowly. Yes, slowly. That was the pace of all healing. Slowly, he stopped checking every message like it might hide a threat. Slowly, he stopped hearing Marcus's voice in every financial question. Slowly, he stopped apologizing for trusting someone who did not deserve it. Slowly, he let the wound become memory instead of present danger. And slowly, he understood that surviving betrayal does not mean becoming suspicious of everything. It means becoming wiser about what deserves your trust. A year after everything started, the company hosted a small internal dinner to mark the recovery. Nothing grand, no cameras, no speeches for the public, just the people who had stayed, helped, worked, and told the truth. Daniel stood up at the end of the night and thanked them. Then he paused, looked around the room and said, "A year ago, I thought this business might break me." The room went quiet. He continued, "Instead, it taught me something I will never forget. Trust is not a weakness, but it is also not a reward for blind loyalty. It is a responsibility, and I intend to carry it that way from now on." No one clapped immediately. They just looked at him because they knew what that cost. And because they knew he meant it. Later, when we got home, he took off his jacket, loosened his tie, and sat down beside me on the couch. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I think I finally feel like the company is mine again." I smiled softly. "It was always yours." He shook his head. "No, not really. Not in the way it is now." That made sense. But always completely. And when it does, the man who built on deception is the one left empty. There was one final thing Daniel never expected after all of it was over. Peace did not arrive like a miracle. It arrived like a habit. Not suddenly, not all at once. Just quietly, one ordinary day at a time. At first, he did not notice it. He noticed only the absence of panic. The absence of sudden calls in the middle of the night. The absence of seeing Marcus's name on a screen and feeling his stomach drop. The absence of having to explain the same betrayal again and again to people who only half understood it. The company still needed work, of course. There were still audits, still new systems, still guarded conversations with lawyers and investors. Still moments when Daniel would stare at a document too long before signing it. But the fear was no longer running the house. That was the change. That was the victory. One morning, nearly a year after the truth had been exposed, Daniel and I took a walk before sunrise. The city was still quiet. The sidewalks were damp from overnight rain, and the air felt clean in a way that made everything seem sharper. We did not speak much at first. We just walked side by side through the empty streets. After a while, he said, "I used to think healing would feel more dramatic." I smiled and looked ahead. "Most real healing is boring." He gave a soft laugh. "That is not what people say in movies." "No," I said, "but movies are usually lying." He nodded, still smiling a little. Then he stopped walking for a second and looked at the sky. "The strange thing," he said, "is that I do not hate Marcus the way I thought I would." I turned to him. He continued, carefully choosing his words. "I hate what he did. I hate the damage. I hate the lies. But the anger itself, it has started to fade." I was quiet for a moment. "That means you are moving on," I said. He exhaled. "It feels more like letting go of something heavy." That was exactly what it was. Not forgiveness, not approval, just release. And release, after betrayal, is its own kind of freedom. The legal case had already closed by then. Not neatly, not with perfect satisfaction, but with enough finality that the chapter was officially over. Marcus was gone from the business world we knew. His name still appeared in documents, of course, in statements, in filings, in records that would outlive the headlines. But the power he once had over Daniel's life was gone. That mattered. Still, even after the case ended, Daniel kept asking himself one question. Why did I trust him for so long? I heard it enough times that I eventually gave the answer I thought he needed. "Because you were loyal," I said. He looked at me. "You gave him the benefit of the doubt because that is how you treat people you value. That is not a flaw. The flaw was his." He stayed quiet after that. Then he nodded slowly, as if the words were entering a place inside him that had been waiting for them. The next few months brought a new rhythm. Daniel hired carefully. He reviewed systems personally. He trained managers to notice patterns early. He built a culture where questions were not treated like disloyalty. And the more he did that, the more the company transformed. Not just operationally. Ethically, people started speaking with more honesty because they saw honesty rewarded. That had been missing before. Marcus had created a surface of confidence, but underneath there had been fear. Now there was something better. A company that did not pretend to be perfect. A company that knew the cost of silence. One evening, Daniel asked me to look at a proposal for a new internal leadership program. "It's for younger employees," he said. "I want them to understand how trust, responsibility, and accountability actually work." I read the draft and smiled. "This is good." He looked nervous for a second, which was rare now. "Do you think it sounds too preachy?" I shook my head. "No. It sounds like someone who learned the hard way." He let out a breath and leaned back in his chair. "That's probably what it is." Then he said something I did not expect. "I think I want to speak about this publicly." I looked up. "Not the ugly details," he said quickly. "Not all of it, but enough to help other leaders notice the signs sooner." I considered that. It was not an easy thing to do. Speaking about betrayal publicly means opening a wound in front of strangers. It means risking judgment. It means allowing people to look at your pain and form opinions about it. But Daniel was not the man he had been before. He understood now that silence can protect shame as easily as it protects dignity. So he did it. He gave a quiet, honest talk at a small business leadership event. No dramatic music. No big stage persona. Just a man telling the truth about how trust had been used against him and how slowly rebuilding had taught him to lead differently. He spoke about warning signs. About overconfidence, about the danger of letting one charming person control too much information, about how people in power often ignore discomfort because they mistake it for inconvenience. The audience listened differently than I expected, not because the story was flashy, because it was real, and real stories stay in people longer. Afterward, a few younger founders came up to thank him. One woman said, "I thought something was wrong in my company, but I kept ignoring it because I didn't want to seem suspicious." Daniel looked at her kindly and said, "Suspicion and awareness are not the same thing. Trust yourself enough to ask the question." I stood a little to the side and watched that exchange with a quiet ache in my chest. That was the value of everything he had gone through. It had not only hurt him, it had made him able to help others avoid the same trap. Still, I will not pretend it made him invincible. Some days, a small thing would still bring it all back. A message with too much polish, a sudden change in someone's tone, a signature that looked almost too confident. He did not always say anything when it happened, but I saw it in his face. The brief pause, the brief look, the old caution returning for just 1 second. Then, usually, he would breathe, ask the extra question, and keep going. That too was growth. Not absence of fear, just mastery over it. One night, we sat in the kitchen long after dinner had ended. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of the refrigerator and the soft movement of rain outside. Daniel was holding a mug that had gone cold. He looked tired, but peaceful, in a way I had not seen in a long time. "I think I understand something now," he said. I waited. He turned the mug slowly in his hands. "I used to think trust meant giving someone everything until they proved otherwise." I nodded slightly. "Now I think trust should start small and grow through consistency." "That's wise." He gave a brief smile. "It had better be. It cost me enough to learn it." I smiled back, but I could also feel the seriousness underneath his words, because that was the truth. Wisdom often comes after damage, and sometimes the price is almost unbearable. A few weeks later, we received a package at the office. No return address. Inside was an old company photograph from before everything collapsed. Daniel and Marcus stood side by side in the center of the image, both smiling at a client event. You could see the warmth in Daniel's face. You could see the charm in Marcus's posture. To anyone looking from a distance, they might have seemed like two men building something great together. But now, after everything, that photograph looked different. Not innocent. Not nostalgic. Just sad. At the bottom of the box was a note. Nothing threatening. Nothing dramatic. Just 3 words. "Be careful again." Daniel stared at the note for a long time. Then he laughed once. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurdly small compared to everything that had happened. "Someone still thinks this story is about fear," he said. I looked at him. "What do you think it is about?" He folded the note carefully and set it aside. "It's about truth outlasting lies." That was a good answer. Maybe the best one. Because in the end, Marcus had lost more than a case. He had lost his place in the story. The company moved on without him. Daniel moved on without him. And the people who had once been fooled learned to look harder at what they called loyalty. That is how betrayal changes a room. It makes people notice what they used to ignore. It makes them more careful with praise, more thoughtful with trust, less impressed by perfect smiles, more respectful of quiet integrity. And perhaps that was the real gift hidden inside all the pain. Not the betrayal itself. Never that. But the clarity it forced. The company was better because of it. Daniel was better because of it. Even I was different because of it. I no longer believe that the worst danger always arrives loudly. Sometimes the worst danger comes dressed in convenience. Sometimes it sounds helpful. Sometimes it says, "I've got this." Sometimes it smiles and calls you brother. And that is why attention matters. That is why truth matters. That is why people like Daniel survive. Not because they never get fooled, but because they eventually choose truth over comfort. And once that choice is made, the lies lose their power. For Daniel, the final proof of that came one quiet evening at home. We were standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. He was calm now, almost fully himself again. He said, "I used to think I lost a partner." I turned to him. He continued, "But maybe I didn't lose a partner. Maybe I lost a mistake I was carrying for too long." I let that sit between us for a moment. Then I said, "That sounds like something only a survivor could say." He looked at me and smiled, truly this time. And in that smile, I saw the version of him that had returned, not the one before betrayal. Not exactly. Something more complete than that. A man who had seen what lies can do, and still chose not to become one himself. A man who had been framed, wounded, tested, and nearly broken, but who came out the other side with a deeper understanding of loyalty, leadership, and self-respect. That is what this story was always about. Not money, not scandal, not even revenge. It was about the moment truth finally stood up in the room and refused to leave. And once that happened, everything else had to change. The company changed. The people changed. Daniel changed. I changed. Because when someone you trusted tries to destroy you, you either become smaller from the wound or stronger because of it. Daniel chose strength. Not loud strength, not revenge strength, quiet strength. The kind that rebuilds. The kind that listens. The kind that protects. There is a moment after every deep betrayal when life becomes almost strangely ordinary again. That was the part nobody prepares you for. You expect the anger. You expect the court dates. You expect the long nights and the legal documents and the questions that never quite stop. But you do not expect the grocery store. You do not expect laundry. You do not expect to stand in your kitchen one morning, holding a coffee mug, and realize the world is still moving exactly the way it always did. That was how it felt for Daniel and me. After everything, the scandal had faded from the headlines. The investigation had closed. The legal mess was mostly behind us. The company had survived, though not unchanged. Marcus was gone, and the fear he left behind was slowly losing its grip. But life did not return to normal in one clean line. It returned in pieces. A quiet breakfast. A laugh that came back unexpectedly. A meeting that ended without disaster. A night of sleep that was not broken by bad memories. Those small things became victories. One of the last things Daniel had to do was review the final internal report. It was a thick document, full of evidence, timelines, and reconstructed records. He read it alone in his office late one evening, while I waited in the lobby downstairs. He had asked me to stay nearby, not because he needed protection, but because he did not want to sit with it alone. When he finally came out, he looked calm. Too calm, maybe. The kind of calm that appears only after someone has already fought every storm inside himself. He sat down beside me and said nothing for a few moments. Then he asked, "Do you want to know the worst part?" I turned toward him. Of course. He looked straight ahead. The report proves Marcus planned this far earlier than I thought. Not weeks, months, maybe more than a year. I felt my stomach tighten, though I had already suspected it. Daniel continued. He used every casual conversation, every shared decision, every moment of trust, and turned it into a step in his own plan. He paused. I keep thinking about that now. How normal it all looked while he was doing it. I stayed quiet. He was never in a hurry, Daniel said. That's what scares me most. He was patient. I nodded slowly. People like that are terrifying, I said. Daniel gave a faint, tired laugh. Not terrifying. Efficient. I looked at him carefully. He noticed. What? He asked. You sound different when you say it now, I told him. He leaned back and folded his hands together. I think that's because I'm no longer trying to make it make sense. That was true. He had spent months trying to understand Marcus, trying to answer the impossible question of why someone would smile while building such a cruel trap. But some things do not become less ugly when explained. They only become clearer. And clarity, painful as it is, was what Daniel had finally earned. A week later, he invited the senior leadership team to a closed-door meeting. He wanted to talk about the company's future, but more importantly, he wanted to talk about the culture Marcus had helped create before he was exposed. I sat in the back of the room, listening. Daniel stood at the front without notes. That was new. He used to prepare every sentence like a shield. Now he spoke like a man who had already been through the worst and had no interest in pretending. He told them the company had made a serious mistake by putting too much control in one person's hands. He admitted that the warning signs had been there. He admitted that some people had been afraid to speak. He admitted that trust had been treated like an assumption instead of a responsibility. Then he said something that made the whole room still. I do not want blind loyalty here anymore, he said. I want informed loyalty. I want people who will question things. I want people who will challenge me if they think I'm wrong. Nobody moved. He continued, if your instinct tells you something is off, speak. If you see a pattern, report it. If a powerful person makes you uncomfortable, do not assume that discomfort is your problem to manage alone. I watched faces around the room change as he spoke. Some people looked relieved. Some looked guilty. A few looked like they were hearing the first honest leadership message they had ever received. That was the kind of leadership Daniel had become. Not the polished version, the real version, the one shaped by damage. After the meeting, one of the department heads came up to him and said, that was the most honest thing I've heard in this company. Daniel nodded once. It should not have taken betrayal for us to get there. The man had no response to that. Neither did I, because he was right. That was the terrible irony. Sometimes the truth only gets room to breathe after a disaster. A few days after that, Priya asked to meet me for coffee. She looked more relaxed than I had seen her in months, but still careful, the way people are when they have been close to chaos and are not fully convinced it is gone. She smiled when she sat down. I wanted to thank you, she said. I frowned slightly. For what? For pushing Daniel to listen. She replied, I know you were the one who first noticed things were wrong. I waved that off a little. You found the records. Yes, she said, but you saw the pattern before the others did. That mattered. I looked down at my cup. She leaned forward and lowered her voice. People like Marcus are good at making everyone else doubt themselves, she said. I almost ignored the signs because I thought I was being paranoid. I met her eyes. That's how they win at first, I said, by making concern feel silly. Priya gave a small, bitter laugh. Exactly. Then she added something that stayed with me. I think the company's different now because Daniel was willing to be embarrassed in order to be honest. That was such a simple sentence, but it was true. If he had chosen pride, the truth would have stayed buried longer. If he had chosen image over reality, more people would have been hurt. Instead, he let the embarrassment happen, and that made all the difference. As for Marcus, the quiet after the scandal was almost worse than the noise. There were no more dramatic confrontations, no more public excuses, no more carefully constructed lies, just legal reality, the kind that does not care how charming you were in a meeting, the kind that follows documents and money trails and electronic records, the kind that does not forget. The final outcome was not broadcast everywhere, but it was enough. Enough to close the chapter. Enough to protect the company. Enough to make sure his name could no longer hide behind respectability. Daniel never celebrated that. He didn't need to. The victory was not Marcus's fall. The victory was the survival of truth. One evening, months later, Daniel and I were sitting on the balcony again. The city was calmer than usual. Summer heat hovered in the air, but the wind had softened it. He was holding a glass of water and watching the traffic below with a stillness I had not seen in him before. I asked him, "What are you thinking about?" He smiled faintly without turning his head. "How strange it is," he said, "that the worst year of my life also taught me the most." I rested my arms on the railing. "That sounds about right." He nodded. "I used to think people changed because they were forced to," he said. "Now I think they change only when they stop lying to themselves." That was wise and heavy, because Marcus had not changed. He had only revealed what was already there. But Daniel had changed in the deepest way. He had looked at betrayal directly and refused to become its mirror. He had not answered manipulation with cruelty. He had not answered deceit with revenge. He had answered it with structure, truth, and patience. That was harder and stronger. A few weeks later, the company held its first annual review since the scandal. The room felt different from before. Less flashy, less forced, more real. People asked harder questions. They talked more openly about risk. They did not worship confidence the way they used to. Instead, they valued transparency. I watched Daniel move through the meeting with an ease I had not seen before. Not because he had forgotten the past, because he had finally stopped being haunted by it. At one point, a young manager asked him, "How do you rebuild trust after it's been broken?" The room quieted. That question mattered to everyone there. Daniel thought about it for a moment before answering. "You do it slowly," he said. "And honestly, you don't demand that people forget. You don't pretend the damage didn't happen. You put in systems that make betrayal harder. You admit when things are fragile. And you prove over time that your word means something." No one interrupted. He continued, "Trust is not a speech. It is a pattern." I almost smiled when he said that. It sounded like someone who had paid dearly to learn the difference. After the meeting, several employees thanked him, not because the past was gone, because it had finally been named. That mattered. Naming the wound does not heal it instantly, but it stops the denial. And denial is where damage grows. That night, we came home late. Daniel set his keys down, loosened his tie, and stood in the kitchen for a long moment without speaking. Then he said almost to himself, "I think I'm okay now." I looked up from the counter. He smiled a little. "Not perfect," he said. "Not fully healed. But okay." I believed him, and I think he believed it too. That was the beginning of peace, not the end of memory, not the end of caution, just the beginning of a life where betrayal no longer sat at the center of every thought. The next morning, he did something I did not expect. He opened the company email, wrote a short message to the entire staff, and thanked them for the honesty and discipline they had shown during the rebuilding. Then he added one line at the end. "We will not grow by pretending to be flawless. We will grow by refusing to hide what is real." He read it back to me before sending it. I said, "That's good." He looked relieved. Then, with a small smile, he hit send. That tiny act felt bigger than all the dramatic moments before it, because it meant he was no longer reacting to Marcus. He was no longer trapped in the old story. He was writing the next one. And that, more than anything, was the final victory. Not that he exposed the betrayal. Not that he won the legal fight. Not even that the company survived. It was that he did not let Marcus define the rest of his life. He refused to become a man who sees betrayal everywhere. He refused to let one terrible person poison every future relationship. He refused to confuse healing with hardness. And that choice gave him back his life. It gave the company back its future. It gave the people around him a better leader. And it gave me something I had not expected to find in the middle of all that pain. A deeper respect for quiet strength. Because real strength does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting in a room full of evidence, breathing slowly, and choosing truth anyway. Sometimes it looks like a woman noticing what others missed and refusing to look away. Sometimes it looks like a team learning to speak honestly after being silenced too long. Sometimes it looks like a company rebuilding itself on better foundations. And sometimes it looks like peace arriving so quietly that you almost miss it. But it is there, in the coffee mug left on the table, in the earlier bedtime, in the lighter tone in Daniel's voice, in the way he no longer flinches at every phone notification, in the way he can now speak about Marcus without feeling the whole past come crashing back. That is what survival looks like after betrayal. Not forgetting, not pretending, just living, finally, fully, and with eyes open. There was one more lesson Daniel learned after peace returned. It was not about business. It was not about money. It was about the strange guilt that sometimes follows survival. He did not say it at first. Men like Daniel often do not. They carry pain quietly and call it responsibility. But one night, after a long day of meetings, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and finally admitted it. "I keep wondering why I gotta keep everything," he said. I looked up from my tea. He continued, "I kept the company. I kept my life. I kept my name. Some people lost jobs because of the mess Marcus made. Some clients walked away. Some employees had to rebuild from scratch. And I'm still here." I listened carefully. He was not asking for pity. He was asking a harder question. "Why me?" he said. "Why did I survive the worst of it?" The room went very still. That kind of question never has an easy answer. I set the cup down. "Because you told the truth when it mattered," I said softly. He looked unconvinced. "That doesn't explain why others suffered." "No," I said. "It doesn't. But surviving is not the same as being spared. You were hurt too." He lowered his eyes. "You are not responsible for every consequence Marcus caused," I said. "You are responsible for what you do after it." That stayed with him. Not because it solved everything, because it finally gave his guilt a place to sit. The next morning, he did something quietly powerful. He approved a support fund for employees affected by the scandal. Nothing flashy, no press release, no public speech, just real help. Legal assistance for the staff who needed it. Career support for those who had left. Bonuses for the people who had worked through the hardest months. And a private apology one by one to the people whose trust had been shaken by the chaos. That was Daniel now. Not the man who used to think leadership meant standing untouched above the damage. The man who understood that good leadership sometimes means carrying the cost with others. That changed the culture even more than the audits did. People began to see that honesty was not just being demanded from them. It was being practiced by the person at the top. That is what made it real. A few weeks later, I found an old notebook in Daniel's office drawer. It was from before everything fell apart. Inside were handwritten notes from meetings, ideas for product launches, lists of investor concerns, and random reminders he had jotted down in the middle of stressful days. On the last page, there was one line that made me stop. "Marcus will handle it. He always does." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Not because it was dramatic, because it was so ordinary. That was the danger. Betrayal does not always begin with a warning siren. Sometimes it begins with confidence, with convenience, with letting someone else carry too much because they seem capable. It begins when trust is confused with surrender. I showed the notebook to Daniel later that evening. He looked at the page and went silent. Then he gave a small, sad smile. "I wrote that without thinking," he said. "That's the point," I replied. He nodded slowly. "I gave him more access than I should have." I shook my head. "You gave him trust." He turned it into leverage. He read the page again, then closed the notebook. "I'll never write that sentence again," he said, and I knew he meant it. The months that followed were gentler. Not easy, just gentler. The company had found its footing. The systems were stronger. The people were more careful and more honest. There were no dramatic victories left to chase. Only consistency. Only time. Only the quiet proving of a better future. Daniel began spending more evenings at home. Not because he was less driven, because he understood more clearly what mattered. He started cooking on Sundays, badly at first, then better. He took phone calls on the balcony instead of pacing the whole house. He laughed more often, and the laugh sounded real again. Not forced, not polished, real. That was when I knew the old fear was finally losing. One Saturday afternoon, we went to a small cafe downtown. Nothing fancy. Just coffee, sunlight, and the soft noise of people talking around us. A young couple at the next table was arguing in that quiet, tired way people do when they are too close to the end of patience. Daniel noticed them, then looked back at me and smiled faintly. "What?" I asked. He shrugged. "Nothing. I just think I understand people better now." I raised an eyebrow. He leaned back in his chair. "Before all this, I thought people were either loyal or not, good or bad, honest or dishonest." I waited. "Now I know it's messier than that," he said. "Some people lie to survive. Some people betray because they want power. Some people stay silent because they are afraid. And some people do the right thing even when it's hard." That was a wise summary. I said, "So, which ones are the most dangerous?" He thought for a second. "The ones who look calm while doing harm." I nodded. He gave a small smile. "That used to be Marcus. The name did not land the same way anymore. That was progress. Not erasing the past, just removing its power." That evening, Daniel got an email from an unknown sender. For a moment, I saw his expression shift in that old way, the way it used to when a message might mean trouble. He opened it carefully. I watched him read. Then he exhaled. "What is it?" I asked. He turned the screen toward me. It was from one of the younger employees who had joined during the rebuilding period. The message was simple. "Thank you for making this company a place where people can speak honestly again." I almost smiled. Daniel sat back and said, "That means more than all the awards I've ever gotten." I believed him. Because after betrayal, the deepest reward is not applause. It is trust earned cleanly. It is hearing someone say they feel safe because of the changes you helped make. It is proof that pain did not end in damage. It became structure. It became policy. It became culture. It became a warning passed on to others so they would not have to learn the same lesson the hard way. That winter, Daniel was invited to speak at another leadership event. This time, he did not hesitate. He did not need to. When he stood before the audience, he spoke about a very simple idea. He said, "The people closest to your numbers are not always the people closest to your values." The room went silent. He continued, "If you run a business, or a team, or any kind of organization, remember this. Character is not proven by charm. It is proven by pattern. Watch the pattern." That line spread faster than the rest of the talk. And for good reason. It was clean. It was true. It came from pain earned honestly. After the event, several people came up to thank him. A few admitted they had their own warning signs at work. and we're now planning to pay closer attention. One older executive shook Daniel's hand and said, "You turned a wound into wisdom." Daniel smiled politely, but after the man walked away, he looked at me and whispered, "I would have preferred the wound never happened." I smiled back. "Of course you would." He nodded. "But if it had to happen," he said, "I'm glad it didn't turn me into someone else." That was the most important part, because betrayal can change a person in two directions. Sometimes they call you overthinking. Sometimes they want the comfort of denial more than the discomfort of truth. But if you are right, and you keep watching, the truth eventually catches up. It always does. And when it does, the people who stayed awake in the dark become the ones who help others see in daylight. That is what happened here. A company was nearly destroyed. A man was nearly framed. A partnership was shattered. But the truth survived. And because the truth survived, so did everything worth keeping. Years from now, Daniel may not remember every email. He may not remember every hearing or every file number or every headline. But he will remember the feeling. The feeling of realizing someone he trusted had been building a trap around him. And he will remember the moment that trap broke. Not because of luck, because someone paid attention. Someone asked one more question. Someone refused to ignore the wrong feeling in her chest. Someone chose truth, and that changed everything. That is the ending I want to leave behind. Not revenge, not destruction, not even justice, though justice mattered. The ending is this. A good man was tested by betrayal, and he did not let it steal his soul. He kept his heart. He kept his integrity. He kept going. And when the dust settled, the only thing stronger than the lie was the truth that outlasted it. That is why this story matters, because it reminds us that trust is precious, but truth is priceless. But even after all that, one question still lingered in the back of my mind. What do you do when the person who betrayed you was once the person you trusted most? You do not erase them. You do not pretend the hurt never happened. You do not force yourself to forgive too quickly just to make other people comfortable. You carry the lesson. That is what Daniel did. And that is what I learned beside him. There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. For Daniel, Marcus became that line. Before Marcus was exposed, Daniel believed that loyalty was something you could measure by years, by shared victories, by late nights and handshakes and old stories. Afterward, he understood something much harder. Loyalty is not proven by how long someone stays close. It is proven by what they do when they think nobody is watching. That was the real lesson hidden inside the pain. And once Daniel understood that, he stopped asking the wrong questions. He stopped asking, "How did I miss it?" He started asking, "How do I build better from here?" That changed everything. He redesigned the company from the inside out. He brought in stronger checks and balances. He made financial reporting more transparent. He created spaces where employees could speak without fear. He insisted that no one person should ever again hold so much hidden power. And quietly, almost without anyone noticing at first, the company became healthier than it had ever been. Not because the betrayal was good, never that, but because Daniel refused to let the damage stay wasted. That is what strong people do. They take the wreckage and turn it into warning signs for the future. They do not romanticize pain. They repurpose it. One evening, about 2 years later, I found Daniel standing by the window in our home, watching the rain fall over the city. He seemed calmer than he had in years. Not untouched. Not naive. Just calm there. I walked over and stood beside him. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. He kept looking outside. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that I don't hate the man I used to be anymore." I glanced at him. He smiled faintly. The one who trusted too easily. The one who thought good intentions were enough. The one who assumed that being fair would protect him. I waited. Then he said, he was not weak. He was just unprepared. That was the first time I saw him speak about his old self with kindness instead of embarrassment. And that meant more than any court outcome ever could. Because the deepest damage betrayal causes is not only in the business or the reputation, it is in the way it teaches you to look at yourself. Daniel had spent so long wondering if he was foolish for believing in Marcus. Now, finally, he was done punishing himself for having a clean heart in a dirty room. That was freedom. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. A few months after that, he hosted a small dinner for the team that had helped hold the company together during the worst of it. Nothing big. No press. No speeches written by public relations people. Just a table full of people who had survived something ugly and come out more honest. At one point in the evening, one of the younger managers raised a glass and said, "To truth, even when it arrives late." The others smiled. Daniel looked around the table, and I could see it in his face. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. Relief. Not because the past was gone, because it no longer owned him. When the dinner ended, he and I walked out into the night air together. The city lights shone on the wet pavement. Cars passed in the distance. People hurried home to their ordinary lives. Daniel stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and took a slow breath. "I used to think losing trust was the end of something," he said. I looked at him. "It can be," I replied. He nodded. Then he said, "Now I think it's also the beginning of seeing clearly." I smiled softly. That was the last lesson. Not that betrayal makes you stronger by itself. It does not. It wounds. It shakes. It leaves scars. But if you survive it with your integrity intact, you come out with something no liar can steal. Discernment, a steadier heart, a sharper eye, a quieter courage. And maybe that is why this story mattered so much. Because somewhere out there, someone is trusting the wrong person right now. Someone is ignoring the small signs because they do not want to seem paranoid. Someone is believing a smile because the truth feels too painful. Someone is standing where Daniel once stood. And maybe this story will remind them to look a little closer, to ask one more question, to pay attention before the trap closes. Because the truth does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives in a detail, a pause, a mismatch, a feeling that something is off. And if you listen to that feeling in time, it might save everything. That is how Daniel survived. That is how the company survived. That is how the truth won. Not in one loud explosion, but in 1,000 careful steps toward honesty. And when the final accounting was done, the final lie exposed, and the final shadow cleared, only one thing remained standing tall. A man who had been betrayed and did not become betrayal himself. That, in the end, was the real victory.